They should have been back by now.
Prince Edric will not be coming today.
Your ladies should not have left you alone.
He should have sent word.
A second chance.
The answer is no.
The dress would not close. Rosalind Kane stood alone in the candlelit dressing chamber of Cavendish Hall, her back exposed, her fingers twisted behind her, searching for a lace hook she could not reach. Her ladies had gone to fetch wine. Her mother had gone to speak with the wedding coordinator. Her prince had not yet sent word that he had arrived at all, and it was the night before her wedding. She breathed through the tightness in her chest, not from the corset, but from something worse. Something that had been growing quietly for months beneath all the flowers and the guest lists and the announcement in the Royal Gazette. The feeling that she was preparing for a ceremony the groom had not truly agreed to attend. She pulled at the fabric. The hook slipped. She tried again. The door opened behind her. She assumed it was her maid. She did not turn around. "Close it," she said simply. "The back, I cannot reach." Silence. And then, footsteps, slow, deliberate. Not the light, quick steps of a lady's maid. The hands that found the lace of her gown were large and certain. Bare fingers, no gloves. They did not fumble or hesitate. One smooth motion and the hook was caught, the fabric drawn together with a precision that felt almost practiced. Then the second hook. Then the third. Each one fastened with the kind of quiet authority that made her skin go still beneath the silk. She did not breathe. The last hook closed, and the hands withdrew. "Your ladies should not have left you alone," said a voice from
Your ladies should not
directly
have left
behind
you
her.
alone.
Low, unhurried, with the particular cadence of a man who had spent so long being obeyed that his words had lost the need to rise into questions. Rosalind turned slowly. He was tall, dark-haired. He wore the charcoal formal coat of a visiting dignitary. No crest, no sash, as though he had simply dressed in whatever shade best suited the shadows and walked into a room that did not belong to him. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His eyes were pale gray, the kind of gray that looked warm from a distance and cold the moment they settled directly on you. They were settled directly on her now. She recognized him. Not personally, they had never spoken, but by reputation, by the weight that walked into a room 2 steps ahead of him. Duke Hadrian Carell of Varenhold. He was not supposed to be in this wing of the hall. He was not supposed to be in this room at all. He was here as a political courtesy only, invited because Prince Edric of Calvin had long-standing trade negotiations with Varenhold, and insulting Hadrian Carell was something even a prince thought twice about. He was watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. Not a scandal. Not amusement. Something quieter than either. "You are not my maid," she said. "No. You walked into my dressing chamber. The door was open. A pause. You asked someone to close the dress. I assumed it was someone I had invited. I can leave," he said. But he did not move. Rosalind looked at him for one moment longer than she should have. The candlelight was generous to his face and less generous to her composure. She turned toward the mirror instead, smoothing the silk at her waist. "You are the Duke of Varenhold, and you are Rosalind Kane," he said. "The woman marrying a man who has not yet arrived for his own rehearsal dinner." The words landed without venom, simply stated as facts, which was somehow worse. Her jaw tightened. "Edric will be here. I did not say he would not be." She met his eyes in the mirror. He was still watching her, directly, without the sideways careful glances most men used when they thought they were being subtle. This man did not pretend not to look. "What are you doing in this wing of the house?" she asked. "I took a wrong turn," he said. Then, quietly. The east corridor was not well marked. He was lying. They both knew it. But Rosalind was too tired and too braced for tomorrow to press the point. She simply lifted her chin. The rehearsal is in the main hall, West Wing. You have taken a considerable wrong turn. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly. More like the shape a smile would leave if it passed through quickly enough. So I have, he said. He bowed. A formal, perfectly executed bow, and left. Rosalind stood in front of the mirror for a long moment after the door closed, her heart doing something she did not have the vocabulary for. Then her maid returned, breathless with apology, and the evening continued on its arranged path. But later, alone in the dark, with the wedding gown hanging like a ghost in the corner of the room, she thought of his hands on the hooks of her dress, the certainty of them, the stillness. She told herself it meant nothing. She almost believed it. The morning of the wedding came in white. Snow had fallen overnight, thin and early for the season, and Cavendish Hall stood against it like an engraving. The chapel had been filled with cream roses and trailing ivy. The musicians had been warming their strings since dawn. The kitchen had been running since before that. Everything was prepared. The groom was not there. Rosalind sat in the bridal chamber, dressed and veiled, her mother moving in tight circles by the window. Lady Maren Kane had the particular quality of a woman who had grown up in court. She did not show panic openly. She showed it in the number of times she adjusted her own cuffs. She had adjusted them 9 times in the past 20 minutes. He's simply delayed, her mother said. The roads from Calvin were icy. He was supposed to arrive yesterday, Rosalind said quietly. And he did not, which is unfortunate but hardly. He was supposed to arrive yesterday, Rosalind repeated, slowly, with the patience of a woman choosing her words around the feeling that was pressing up beneath her ribs. He missed the rehearsal dinner. He has not sent a message. His private secretary told Lord Pembrey that the prince's schedule had encountered complications and that he would send word. Her mother looked at her window. When was that message sent? Last night, Lady Maren said. But surely by now, a knock at the door. The wedding coordinator, a brisk woman named Mrs. Holford, entered with the expression of someone who had delivered bad news before and had developed a manner for it. Measured, precise, like a physician. Lady Rosalind, she said, His Highness Prince Edric has sent word. Rosalind straightened in her chair. He is delayed? A pause. The kind that went a moment too long. His Highness sends his sincere regrets, Mrs. Holford said. He will not be able to attend the ceremony today. He asks that the wedding be postponed and that alternative arrangements be discussed through the relevant diplomatic channels at a future date. The room went absolutely silent. Rosalind's mother made a small sound and reached for the windowsill. Rosalind did not move. She sat in her wedding gown, her veil perfectly arranged, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at a point on the opposite wall and said nothing for several seconds. Through the diplomatic channels, she repeated. Yes, my lady. He is ending an engagement announced in the Royal Gazette, attended by 300 guests, and conducted at the estate of one of England's oldest families, through diplomatic channels. Mrs. Holford had the grace to say nothing further. Rosalind stood. Her skirts moved around her, all that silk and intention, all those months of preparation. She looked at herself once in the mirror. Veil. Flowers. The expression of a woman who had known, somewhere in the quiet part of herself, that she had been working very hard not to listen, that this day would end this way. Tell the guests, she said. Mrs. Holford, please go ahead and inform the guests. Her mother finally broke. Rosalind, darling, you mustn't. Not publicly, not yet. We could wait an hour, make some excuse. We will not lie to them, Rosalind said, and they will not make me stand behind a closed door while they wonder. She smoothed the front of her gown. Open the chapel. I will walk out by myself. The chapel was full. 300 people in their finest seated in candlelit pews, watching the altar where no groom stood. The whispers had already begun when Rosalind walked through the doors, unaccompanied, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. She had decided on the short walk from the bridal chamber that she would not cry in front of anyone. Not because she was not allowed to, but because the grief belonged to her privately, and she would not give it to a room full of spectators who would carry it out into drawing rooms across the country. She walked to the front of the chapel. She stopped before the altar. She turned to face the assembled guests, and she spoke. Prince Edric will not be coming today, she said. Her voice did not shake. The engagement has ended. I am sorry for any inconvenience to those who have traveled far. The hall will remain open for luncheon, and I ask that you extend whatever grace you can to my family during a difficult morning. She paused. "And now," she said very quietly, "I would ask for a moment alone." The guests began to murmur. Movement shifted through the pews, and it was in that movement, in the turning of 300 heads, that Rosalind became aware of the man standing against the back wall of the chapel. He had not sat with the other guests. He had arrived at some point during the commotion and stood near the door, still and apart, with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on her. Not on the crowd, not on the altar, on her. Hadrian Carell, the Duke of Varenhold. He was watching her the way a man watches something rare and fragile that has just refused to break, with an expression she could not name but that settled in her chest like the weight of something honest. She looked away. She walked to the small side door of the chapel and stepped through it, and for a moment, alone in the cold stone corridor with snow falling softly past the high window, Rosalind Kane finally let herself feel it. Not the humiliation, not the public spectacle. Something quieter. The ache of having half known something was wrong and chosen, out of duty, to hope she was mistaken. She pressed her hand flat against the cold wall and breathed. The luncheon was held in the main hall, as she had promised. It had the particular quality of a gathering where everyone wanted to leave and no one felt they could be the first to go. Rosalind moved through it with the composure she had been trained to maintain since childhood. She accepted condolences without inviting pity. She thanked people for coming. She did not once retreat to a private room, though she wanted to desperately. It was midway through the afternoon when Lord Cassian Morby appeared at her side. Cassian Morby was the younger son of the Marquis of Aldenvale, charming, well-presented, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told he was not interesting enough. He had danced with Rosalind twice at a ball the previous spring, which he had apparently taken as the foundation of something significant. "Lady Rosalind," he said, taking her hand and pressing it, "I am devastated for you. Truly, what a ghastly situation. But I must say," his voice lowered, leaning slightly too close, "a woman of your quality deserves far better than a prince who cannot be bothered to show up. If I may be so bold, I have always thought so." Rosalind extracted her hand with quiet efficiency. "You are kind, Lord Morby." "More than kind," he said, with a smile that had clearly worked on people before. "I have always admired you enormously, and today, seeing your composure, your grace under such difficult, if you were ever in one of, shall we say, a more reliable companion, I would be honored to, Lord Morby." The voice came from slightly to the left, quiet, unhurried, with the particular timbre of a man who had learned, at some early point in his life, that he never needed to raise his voice. Cassian Morby turned. Hadrian Carell stood 2 feet away, his expression perfectly still, a glass held loosely at his side. He was not looking at Morby with aggression. He was looking at him the way a very large, very calm thing looks at something that is about to make a mistake. "She has had a difficult morning," Hadrian said. "I imagine she would appreciate space rather than proposals." Morby blinked. Then he recalibrated with the swiftness of a man who understood titles instinctively. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Your Grace, I meant no offense." He turned to Rosalind with a bow and withdrew. Rosalind watched him go. Then she turned to the Duke. "I did not require rescuing," she said. "I did not rescue you," Hadrian replied. "I simply said what you were thinking." She studied him. He did not look away. "Do you do that often?" she said. "Tell people what I am thinking?" "No. This is the second time we have spoken. And yet you seem very certain. You extracted your hand before I said anything," he said. "I was observant, not presumptuous." Rosalind looked at him for a moment. There was something infuriating about a man who was this difficult to dismiss. She had prepared a mental distance for the Duke of Varenhold. He was a political guest, not her concern, not her sphere. She had intended to treat him as furniture. Polite, present, unremarkable. He kept declining to be furniture. "Thank you," she said, finally. "However unnecessary." "You are welcome," he said. "However unnecessary." She walked away before the silence could turn into something else. But she felt his eyes follow her. That evening, after the guests had finally departed and the hall had settled into its exhausted quiet, Rosalind sat alone in the small library at the end of the east wing. The fire had been lit. Someone had left a decanter of brandy on the side table, which she did not usually touch, but which she was currently touching. She had one glass. She stared at the fire. She was thinking, not about the humiliation. She had put that somewhere to examine later. But about the secret she had not been allowed to think about all day, the thing beneath the abandonment, the detail that Mrs. Halford had whispered to her quietly in the corridor after the public address. Prince Edric had not simply gotten cold feet. There was a woman in Calvin, an attachment of some standing, long maintained, that the Calvin royal house had been managing quietly for 3 years. The engagement to Rosalind had been political. Everyone knew engagements could be political. What no one had apparently told Rosalind was that the political objective had shifted, and Edric had simply never found the appropriate moment to say so. 3 years. He had known for 3 years that he was not going to marry her, and he had said nothing. Her father had declined 2 other approaches during that period. Her life had arranged itself around a future that had already been quietly discarded by the man at its center. She pressed the glass against her cheek and looked at the fire. "You should not be alone tonight." She did not startle this time. She had, she realized distantly, been half expecting him. "This is the library," she said, without turning. "Are you lost again?" "No," Hadrian Carell said, and there was something briefly warm in that word. He came to stand near the opposite chair. He did not sit. He looked at the fire. "You heard?" she said. "About the woman in Calvin?" "Yes." A pause. "Most of the senior guests heard. These things do not stay quiet." "No." She set down the glass. "They do not." He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he did not immediately fill the silence with reassurance. She had heard enough reassurance today to last several seasons. She was grateful for the fire and the stillness. "How long did you know?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "Daddy would not come," she clarified. "This morning. How long before the ceremony did you know he had sent word?" A brief pause. The message arrived at 7:30. She had walked down the aisle at 11, so he had known for 3.5 hours. He had stood in the back of the chapel and watched her walk out and face 300 people, and he had said nothing. She should have been angry. She considered whether she was. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it was not my place," he said, "and because you handled it better without an intermediary. If I had told you in that corridor, you would have had 30 minutes to manage your reaction in private. Instead, you walked out and spoke clearly, and with more dignity than most women of my acquaintance could manage in their best circumstances." He paused. "I did not want to take that from you by making it a crisis rather than a decision." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment. She was not sure whether to be grateful or furious. The line between the two was remarkably thin. "You are a very strange man," she said at last. "I have been told that." She looked at him then, properly. In the firelight, the sharp angles of his face were softened by shadow. He was looking at her with that quality she had noticed twice before, the direct, unhurried attention. Not acquisition. Not appraisal. Something closer to the way you looked at something you had been thinking about for longer than you could explain and had not yet figured out what to do with. "Go to bed, Duke Corral," she said quietly. "I would like to be alone." He inclined his head. "Good night, Lady Rosalind." He left. She sat for a long time after. The fire burned lower. The brandy glass sat untouched on the table. Outside the library window, snow fell again, soft and indifferent, and Rosalind Kane thought about a man who had stood at the back of a chapel for 3.5 hours, watching, saying nothing, and somehow, in the middle of the worst day of her life, making her feel less alone than she had in months. She told herself that meant nothing either. She was beginning to believe she was very bad at lying to herself. In the morning, a note arrived on the breakfast table. No crest, no formal address. Just her name in handwriting that was spare and deliberate. "I will be remaining at Cavendish Hall for 3 more days at Lord Pembry's request regarding the trade discussions with Varenhold. If you have a need for anything, or simply want someone who will not offer you sympathy, the East Sitting Room is generally quiet after 10. H.C. Rosalind read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the pocket of her dress. And at 10:30, she went to the East Sitting Room. The East Sitting Room had 2 armchairs facing a window that looked out over the frozen garden. Someone had lit the fire before she arrived. The tea service was already set, 2 cups, she noticed, which meant either the household staff were perceptive or the Duke of Varenhold had asked. She suspected the latter. He was already there when she entered, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the snow-covered hedgerows with the expression of a man who had been thinking for some time about something that was not the garden. He turned when he heard her. Neither of them said good morning. It seemed too small a phrase for whatever this was. Rosalind sat in the chair nearest the fire. He sat in the other. The tea sat between them, and for a moment neither moved toward it. "You came," he said. "You left a note. I leave notes. People do not always come." She looked at him. "I almost did not." What decided it? She considered lying. She considered something graceful and deflective. She looked at the fire instead and said the honest thing. "I am tired of behaving as though nothing happened. Everyone in this house is treating me like china that might crack if spoken to directly. You are the only person who has not done that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached forward and poured her tea. She watched his hands. She realized, paying an unreasonable amount of attention to his hands. "Tell me about the trade discussions," she said, because she needed something that was not what she was currently thinking. He looked faintly surprised. "You want to talk about trade. I want to talk about something that is not my ruined wedding, and I want to talk to someone who will not soften every sentence before handing it to me. So yes, tell me about trade. What does Varenhold need from England?" Something shifted in his expression. Something that looked almost like relief, as though he too had been trapped all morning in the amber of careful condolences, and was grateful, suddenly, to be in a room where directness was permitted. So he told her. Not in the board summary a man gives when he expects a woman to be politely uninterested. He told her with the specificity of someone who had spent years in rooms where these details mattered. Varenhold's northern ports. The new rail corridor that would change the cost of wool transport by a third. The political resistance from 3 legacy families who had built their influence on the old road system and were not prepared to watch it become irrelevant. Rosalind listened. She asked questions, not performative questions, but the kind that meant she had actually been following. He answered them. He looked at her while he answered, and she noticed that the line between his brows softened as the conversation went on, the way a man's face loosens when he stops expecting to be misunderstood. An hour passed without either of them noticing. It was only when the fire needed tending that Rosalind became aware of the time and of the particular quality of the quiet around them. That warm, inhabited silence that settles between 2 people who have talked long enough to stop performing for each other. She set down her cup. "I should return to my mother," she said. "She will be looking for me." He nodded. He did not press her to stay. She had noticed that about him. He did not press. He presented himself as available and then had the remarkable discipline to simply wait. At the door she paused. "Tomorrow?" she said, and then felt immediately exposed for having said it. He looked at her across the sitting room, the fire between them, the morning light at the window. "Tomorrow," he said. 3 days passed. They met each morning in the east sitting room. They did not announce this arrangement to anyone. They simply appeared at 10 and sat and talked. On the second day she brought a book she had been struggling with, a dense history of Viennese political reform, and complained about the author's tendency to bury his arguments under 6 paragraphs of preamble. Hadrian had read it. He had opinions. They argued about it for 40 minutes with a pleasure that felt almost improper. On the 3rd day, he told her about his mother. She had not asked. He simply began speaking quietly, looking at the garden, and Rosalind had the sense that this was not something he said often. His mother had died when he was 19. She had been the only person in his household who laughed regularly. After her, the house at Varenhold had become what it appeared to be from the outside, large, precise, and very quiet. "Is that when you became the Duke?" Rosalind asked. "No. My father died when I was 24. He paused. But he was already gone before that in every way that mattered. She understood, without asking, what he meant by that. Some absences came before the death. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not tell you for sympathy." "I know. I said it because I meant it. There is a difference." He looked at her. That direct, unhurried look that she had stopped trying to deflect. "Yes," he said. "There is." On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Lord Pembry approached Rosalind in the east corridor with the expression of a man delivering news he hoped she already knew. "His Grace will be departing tomorrow morning," Lord Pembry said. "The Varenhold delegation must return to London by the weekend." Rosalind kept her face composed. "Of course." He asked me to mention it to you directly, Lord Pembry added, rather than simply leaving. She absorbed this. He had sent Pembry to tell her. He had not wanted to leave without notice, without warning, and rather than say so himself, which would have revealed too much, he had arranged a proxy. The precision of it was both very Hadrian and quietly devastating. "Thank him for the courtesy," she said. She walked back to her room and stood at the window and looked at the frozen garden for a long time. He was in the courtyard the following morning seeing the horses when she found him. The morning was steel gray, cold enough to make breath visible. He turned when he heard her steps on the stone. She had not planned what to say. She had come because not coming would have been a form of cowardice she was not prepared to perform. "You are leaving," she said. "Yes." He did not dress in an apology. "London. Then back to Varenhold within the fortnight." "Varenhold is north." "Yes." She looked at him. At the pale gray eyes that had found her in that chapel and not looked away. At the hands that had closed her dress in the dark. "Will you be in London for the season?" she asked. "Parts of it. A pause. I attend selectively." "As do I." She lifted her chin slightly. "Perhaps our selections will overlap." Something moved in his expression. That almost smile, the shape of it. "Perhaps they will," he said. She extended her hand. He took it and bowed over it. Formal, correct, and held it 1/2 second longer than convention required. She felt it in her wrist, in her elbow, in places a glove should have been contained. He released her. He climbed into the carriage. She stood in the courtyard until it had gone through the gates and turned onto the road, and then she went inside and did not think about him for the rest of the morning. She thought about him for the rest of the morning. London arrived in March, as it always did, with a collision of rain and ambition. The season opened with the Ashbourne Ball, where Rosalind appeared for the first time since the broken engagement with the composure that had become, in the intervening weeks, something close to armor. Society had opinions about Edric, of course. Edric's woman in Calvin had been confirmed. There had been a quiet diplomatic exchange, a formal ending to the engagement, and a very brief apology letter that Rosalind had read once and then burned without ceremony. The general consensus among London society was that Rosalind had behaved impeccably throughout, which meant she was now fair game. Cassian Morby had sent flowers twice. A viscount she did not know had sent a letter so breathlessly eager that she had been briefly concerned for his health. Lord Fenwick, who was 53 years old and had buried 2 wives with impressive consistency, had asked her father for a preliminary conversation. Rosalind had told her father, with great patience and love, that she would eat the preliminary conversation before she attended it. She was at the Ashbourne Ball, her second event of the season, moving through the gathering with the practiced grace of a woman who knew how to be present without being available, when she became aware of a shift in the room's attention. It happened in the way it always did when he entered. Not an announcement, just a pressure change, a reorientation of the air. She did not turn immediately. She finished her conversation with Lady Ashbourne, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman, and then, slowly, let her gaze travel to the entrance. Hadrian Carell stood in the doorway. He had not looked for her yet. He was speaking to Lord Ashbourne, nodding at something the older man was saying, with the expression of a man who was politely present and mentally elsewhere. He wore black, as before. He wore it the way some men wore rank, not as decoration but as fact. And then he looked up. Across the crowded ballroom, through the chandeliers and the silk and the noise, his eyes found her the way they had in the chapel, without searching, as though they had simply always known where she was. He inclined his head. She inclined hers. They did not immediately approach each other, which was either the most sophisticated thing 2 people had ever done at a ball, or the most frustrating, depending on how one felt about restraint. She danced twice. Once with a pleasant young lord who said nothing particularly interesting, and once with her cousin who had been sent to check on her by her mother and was making a poor effort of disguising it. She smiled and spoke and moved through the evening. And each time she turned in the dance, she was aware of where Hadrian was in the room. He was not dancing. He stood near the east wall, talking intermittently with the men of his acquaintance, and he was watching her with an expression she was beginning to catalogue. Still, direct. The expression of a man running a thought he had not finished yet. It was during her 3rd dance, a waltz with Cassian Morby, who had appeared at her side with the inevitability of bad weather, that she saw something change in Hadrian's face. She had not wanted to dance with Morby. She had said yes because refusing twice in one season required more explanation than she currently had patience for. He danced adequately. He talked too much. His hand at her waist sat with more familiarity than the steps required. She glanced toward the east wall. Hadrian was watching Morby's hand. The stillness in his expression had changed. It was still controlled. He was always controlled. But there was something underneath it now, something that pulled the line of his jaw tighter and turned his gaze from observing to something considerably more deliberate. Rosalind felt a warmth move through her that she had no business feeling during a waltz with someone else. The music ended. Morby bowed and said something flattering that she did not retain. She turned and walked, with no great hurry, toward the east wall. Hadrian watched her approach. He did not look away. He did not pretend he had not been watching. "Lord Morby dances adequately," he said. "He does," she agreed. "He also speaks continuously. I find the two in combination rather exhausting." "Then why accept? Because I am building a reputation for grace this season," she said, "and refusing every man who asks me to dance does not serve that narrative. You could dance with fewer men, or the right ones." The words came out with more certainty than she had planned. She did not take them back. He looked at her. The ballroom moved around them, 100 conversations and 1,000 small performances, and in the middle of it, this particular silence had its own gravity. "Is that an invitation?" he said. "That depends," she said, "on whether you dance." "I do not, generally." "Generally," she repeated. His hand came up and settled at his side, not reaching for her yet, but positioned like a question. "The next waltz," he said, "if you are willing to be seen." "I am always willing to be seen," she said. "The question is, whether you are." Something passed through his expression then, something she had not seen before, not the almost smile, not the careful stillness. Something stripped of management, something that looked very much like a man who had just realized that he was in considerably more trouble than he had expected. "Dance with me, Rosalind," he said quietly. She placed her hand in his. They danced once. Once was enough to make Lady Ashbourne quietly delighted, her mother quietly alarmed, and Cassian Morby quietly furious. The room noticed. Rooms always notice when the Duke of Varenhold did something he did not normally do, and Hadrian Carell did not normally dance. He danced very well. He led with the same quiet authority with which he did everything, not pulling her, not directing her, but creating such clear space for her to follow that following became its own kind of choice. She was aware of his hand at her waist. She was aware of the warmth of him, the steadiness, the way he watched her face, while they moved as though the music was secondary to whatever he was reading there. "You are staring," she said quietly. "Yes, you might attempt subtlety. I have found subtlety to be largely wasted in ballrooms," he said. "Everyone is watching everyone. The only people who notice a man looking at a woman are the people who have already been looking at the woman themselves." She considered this. That is either very wise or a very elegant excuse for bad manners. Perhaps both. The waltz turned them. She felt the room in her peripheral vision, the watching eyes, the small recalibrations happening in drawing rooms across London in real time. She thought about what this would mean tomorrow, the Duke of Varenhold dancing with the woman Edric had abandoned. The story it would tell. "This will be discussed," she said. "I know. Are you prepared for that?" He looked at her steadily. "Are you asking whether I am prepared for people to know I find you interesting? I am asking whether you have considered the implications. I have considered them since the night I walked into your dressing room and found you alone," he said simply. "I have been considering them daily since. I am not a man who acts without consideration." The music drew toward its close. "And what?" she said. "Did your consideration conclude?" The final bars of the waltz fell away. He stopped moving. They stood at the edge of the dance floor, his hand still at her waist, and he looked at her with that direct, unguarded expression that she had spent weeks trying to understand. "That you are the most composed woman I have ever watched fall apart," he said quietly, "and the most alive I have ever felt in a room, and that I intend to be wherever you are for as long as you permit it." Rosalind looked at him. The room pressed in around them. The music shifted to something lighter. The world continued at its indifferent pace. She took a breath. Then she stepped back just enough, not retreating, but creating the small distance that allowed her to think. "Then you should know," she said, "that I do not intend to be arranged again. Not by my family, not by political necessity, not by anyone." She held his gaze. If you intend to be wherever I am, it will be because I permit it, and I permit it only when I trust it. Understood, he said, without hesitation. I do not trust quickly. I know. I have been watching you protect yourself gracefully for 3 days at Cavendish Hall and 4 weeks at a distance since. I am not in a hurry. She studied him for one long moment. Then she inclined her head, the smallest acknowledgement, the beginning of something. Walk me to supper, she said. He offered his arm. She took it. 3 weeks later, London learned that something had shifted in the world. It was not announced. There was no official statement, no notice in the Gazette. But the city had its own intelligence, assembled from 100 small observations, who arrived where with whom, who danced with whom twice, who was seen in the same corner of the same drawing room at the same evening party more than once. The Duke of Varenhold, who attended selectively, was attending, considerably, and Lady Rosalind Kane, who had been navigating the season with the composed fortitude of a woman who had decided to manage the world on her own terms, was permitting it. The story of Edric's abandonment was being quietly superseded by a different story. The city liked this story better. It had better architecture. What the city did not know, what no one knew except the 2 people inside it, was how it actually felt. Not the public performance of 2 people who had been noticed. The actual thing. The Tuesday morning conversations had resumed, this time at a small hotel drawing room in Mayfair that Lord Pembrey had lent Hadrian for the season. The afternoon when she had arrived in a fury about her father's meeting with Lord Fenwick and had paced the length of the room twice before Hadrian had simply said, quietly, "Tell me what you want," and she had stopped pacing because no one had asked her that plainly in as long as she could remember. What she wanted was not to be bartered, not to be arranged, not to spend her life as the solution to someone else's problem. She had said this. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Then build the terms yourself. You know what you will accept and what you will not. Stop negotiating from their framework and establish your own." It was not a declaration. It was not a romance. It was something she needed more. It was someone who saw her capability and was not frightened by it. She was trying very hard not to be in love with him. She was making poor progress. It was Lord Pembrey who came to her with the first warning, on a gray Tuesday in late March. He found her in the Mayfair drawing room. Hadrian had stepped out briefly to deal with a messenger from the Varenhold estate, and he sat across from her with the expression of a man who had been deciding all morning whether to speak. "Lady Rosalind," he said carefully, "are you aware that Prince Edric has returned to London?" She went still. "He arrived last night," Pembrey continued, quietly. "He is at the Calvin diplomatic residence on Belgrave Street. Apausa. There is talk that he intends to revisit certain arrangements." "What arrangements?" she said. "Your father was contacted this morning. The fire in the grate. The sound of the city outside." Rosalind sat with her hands folded and felt something go cold and certain in her chest. "He is not owed a revisitation," she said. "No," Pembrey agreed, "but he is a prince, and your father, I am told, received the contact with some interest." She looked at Pembrey directly. "My father received it with interest. There are debts, my lady. I am not in a position to explain the full extent, but from what I understand—" "How much?" Pembrey named a number. The cold certainty in her chest spread outward. She understood now. Edric had not returned out of sentiment. He had returned because the woman in Calvin had not worked as planned. She had heard a rumor, a whisper, that the attachment had ended badly and that Edric was now under pressure from the Calvin court to demonstrate stability in succession. A broken engagement was tolerable. A broken engagement followed by a very public second failed attachment was not. He needed a respectable wife. He needed to appear to have corrected his mistake. And her father needed money. She was being arranged again. The door opened. Hadrian returned. He read the room in the time it took to cross the threshold. Pembrey's careful posture, Rosalind's stillness, the quality of the silence. "What has happened?" he said. Not a question. Pembrey looked at Rosalind. She looked at Hadrian. "Edric is in London," she said. He went very still. "He has contacted my father," she continued. "Edric is under pressure to resolve the succession question. My father has debts. The arithmetic is not complicated." Hadrian did not speak immediately. She watched something move through him. Not anger exactly, but something beneath anger, something older and more controlled. The kind of feeling a man had when he had been patient for a long time and was now being asked to continue being patient with something that threatened someone he had decided, quietly and without announcement, to protect. "Your father cannot compel you," Hadrian said. "No," she agreed. "But he can make the alternative very difficult, and Edric has resources." "So do I." The words came out flat and certain, not a boast. A fact, stated with the same quiet authority with which he discussed wool transport and rail corridors. A simple reassessment of available forces. Rosalind looked at him. He looked back. "Hadrian," she said quietly, "I will not be rescued. I know. I will not be handed from one man to another. I know that too. Then what are you suggesting?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am suggesting that you have more options than your father and Edric are currently allowing you to see, and I am suggesting that I am one of them." A pause. "Not as an arrangement, not as a solution to a problem, as a choice if you decide you want to make it." Rosalind held his gaze for a long time. Outside, London went about its business. Inside the drawing room, the fire burned and the clock marked time, and everything between them hung in the air. Weeks of mornings and honesty and one waltz and his hands on the hooks of her dress in the candlelight, hung there, waiting to be named or set down. "Give me time," she said. "You have it," he said. "All of it." She stood. She picked up her gloves from the table. "But Hadrian," she said at the door. He looked at her. "Do not let my father sign anything," she said. Something moved in his expression, that almost smile, and behind it something fiercer, something she had not seen from him before, the look of a man who had just been given permission to act. "No," he said quietly. "He will not." She walked out into the gray London morning. Behind her, she heard him say something to Pembry. Low, direct, the tone of a man giving instructions, and then the door closed. And Rosalind walked through the city with the strange and terrifying sensation of a woman who was beginning to believe, despite everything, that she might actually be safe. The letter from her father arrived the following morning. It was written in his careful, apologetic hand, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades making decisions he knew were wrong and had developed a particular cursive for delivering them. The sentences were long. The justifications were longer. The conclusion was brief. He wished to meet with her. That afternoon, at the family townhouse on Welbeck Street, Prince Edric would also be present. Rosalind read it standing at her dressing table. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease with the precision of someone who understood that the way you handled a piece of paper said something about the way you intended to handle what was written on it. She sent back a single line. "I will come, but I will not be alone." She sent word to Hadrian at 9:30. His reply came within the hour, delivered by a footman she did not recognize, Varenhold livery dark gray, immaculate. "I will be at Welbeck Street before you." "HC," she read it. She put it in the same pocket where she had kept the first note, at Cavendish Hall. The pocket was becoming a kind of archive. She dressed carefully. Not for Edric, not for her father. She dressed for herself, a deep burgundy walking dress that she had always worn when she needed to feel like the full measure of who she was rather than the reduced version other people preferred. She pinned her hair with precision. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She had been here before. Not this room, not this morning, but this feeling. The feeling of walking into a room where something was going to be done to her life without her full consent, dressed in her best, holding herself together with both hands. The difference, this time, was that she was walking in with her eyes open, and she was not walking in alone. The Welbeck Street townhouse had the particular quality of a home that had once been comfortable and was now trying very hard not to show that it was not. The furniture was good but aging. The flowers in the entrance hall were slightly past their best. Her father, Lord Edmund Kane, had the look of a man who had been managing the gap between appearance and reality for so long that the effort had become invisible even to him. He met her in the entrance hall. He kissed her cheek. His eyes went immediately to the figure behind her, Hadrian, who had been waiting, as promised, on the front step when her carriage arrived, and had fallen into step beside her without ceremony. Her father blinked. "I was not aware. I mentioned I would not be alone," Rosalind said pleasantly. "Father, you know the Duke of Varenhold." Hadrian inclined his head. "Lord Kane." Her father's expression moved through several calculations very quickly. He arrived, finally, at a version of welcome that was more apprehension than warmth. Of course, Your Grace. An unexpected, I apologize for any inconvenience, Hadrian said, in a tone that did not sound like an apology at all. I had business on this side of the city. They were shown into the drawing room. Prince Edric was already there. Rosalind had not seen him since before the engagement. She had constructed him in her memory as larger than he was. In person, he was of medium height, fair-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been very handsome at 22 and had since developed the soft, slightly anxious quality of a man who had been managing the consequences of his own decisions for several years. He stood when she entered. His eyes went to her, then to Hadrian, and something shifted in his expression. A recalibration, a reassessment. Lady Rosalind, he said. You look well. Thank you, she said. She sat down without being invited to. You look as though you have had a difficult winter. He had the grace to accept this. He sat across from her. Her father hovered near the mantel. Hadrian stood slightly to her left and slightly behind her, not looming, not performing dominance, simply present in the particular way of a man who had decided that the room contained something he was not prepared to leave unattended. I imagine you received my message, Edric began. I received your message in December, Rosalind said, through Mrs. Hulford in a corridor after walking down the aisle of a chapel at Cavendish Hall to an empty altar. Yes, I remember your message. Edric's jaw tightened slightly. I deserved that. You did. I handled the situation with a great deal of cowardice. I am aware of that. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed sincerity and was discovering it was harder to perform than expected. I want to explain. What happened with the Daily, the arrangement in Calvin, it was complicated. My family placed a great deal of pressure. Edric. Rosalind said his name quietly, without cruelty, but with the absolute finality of a woman closing a door. I do not need your explanation. I do not need your apology either, though I appreciate that you have offered it. She paused. What I need to understand is what you want from this meeting. He looked at her directly for the first time. A second chance. The room was very quiet. Her father made a small movement by the mantel that she did not look at. The arrangement with the Daily ended in February, Edric continued. My position at home requires... I need to address the question of succession. My family requires... He stopped. He tried a different approach. Something more honest, perhaps, or at least more desperate. Rosalind, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but you are the woman my family chose, and I believe, if we were given the chance to know each other properly, you are describing, Rosalind said carefully, an arrangement, a proper courtship, a genuine, you are describing an arrangement, she said again. You need a wife for succession. Your family chose me for reasons of politics and family standing. The personal element is secondary to the structural requirement. She kept her voice even. I understand that very well. I was raised in this world. I am not shocked by it. But I have spent the past several months thinking very clearly about what I will and will not accept, and I have decided that I will not enter another arrangement where the structural requirement is the primary fact, and I am the solution to someone else's problem. Edric looked at her. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had used up most of his easy answers and was standing in front of the difficult ones. Your father, he began. My father's debts are not my responsibility, Rosalind said. Her voice did not shake. I love my father, but I am not a transaction. Silence. Then, from the mantel, Rosalind. Her father's voice. Quiet and careful, and underneath it, the particular shame of a man who knows what he is asking and is asking it anyway. The amount involved is the house, the estate in Hampshire. I know, father. If Edric is offering, I know what Edric is offering. She turned to look at her father properly. Lord Edmund Kane, who had once been warm and capable, and had somewhere along the way chosen the wrong things with the wrong people and spent 20 years compounding the error. She looked at him with love and with clarity, and she said, I know what it cost you to ask me, and I know you believe you have no other option, but you do. You simply have not allowed yourself to see it, because the option that does not involve me requires you to admit the full extent of the problem to people who can help you solve it. Her father's expression crumbled slightly at the edges. There are people, Rosalind said gently, who would assist you in managing this, not because of what I can be sold for, because it is the right thing to do and the resources exist. She did not look at Hadrian, but she was aware of him behind her, steady and present. like a wall she could lean against without touching. I cannot simply, her father began. You can, she said, and you will, because I am asking you to. Edric had been watching this exchange in silence. Now he said, quietly, Lady Rosalind, I see that I have misread the situation considerably. She turned back to him. You misread it at Cavendish Hall, she said. In December, there is no reading to do here. The answer is no. He nodded slowly. The tired face, the used-up options. He stood. He looked at Hadrian for a long moment. The two men looked at each other across the drawing room, and something passed between them that was not aggression, but was not nothing either. An acknowledgement of facts. Your Grace, Edric said to Hadrian. Hadrian inclined his head. Your Highness. Edric left. The drawing room settled into a new silence. Her father sat down heavily in the chair by the mantel. He looked old in a way she had not fully seen before, or had been avoiding seeing. She went to him. She sat on the arm of his chair and put her hand over his, and for a moment they simply sat. I am sorry, he said. Rosalind, I am, for all of it. Edric, the debts, I am sorry. I know, she said. I did not intend. I know, Father. She squeezed his hand. We will fix it. Not this way, but we will fix it. She sat with him for a few more minutes. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and turned. Hadrian was still there. He had not moved, had not spoken, had not inserted himself into a moment that did not belong to him. He had simply been present for the entire thing, available, steady, witness. She looked at him across the room. Thank you, she said quietly. You did not need me, he said. You never need me. But I am glad I was here. She walked toward the door. Hadrian, he looked at her. Come for dinner, she said. Tonight. I will ask my mother to set a place. He looked at her for a long moment. At what time? 7. I will be there at 7, he said. He came at 7. He brought wine, a Varenhold vintage, deep red, with a label she had never seen. He ate dinner at her family's table and spoke to her mother with a patience and genuine attention that made Lady Marin Kane, who had been prepared to be politely hostile, gradually and then entirely won over. He stayed until 9. He did not try to stay longer. At the door, with her mother tactfully retreated to the sitting room, he stood in the entrance hall with his coat on and looked at her with the expression she had catalogued entirely by now, the direct, stripped-down look that had no performance in it. Your father, he said. The debts. I have a proposal. She tilted her head. Not involving you, he said immediately. A business arrangement. There are 3 Varenhold suppliers in Hampshire who have been looking for a reliable land partner for the past 2 seasons. Your father's estate is suitable. The arrangement would clear his debts within 18 months and give him a legitimate ongoing income. Rosalind stared at him. I spoke with Pembry this afternoon, Hadrian continued. The structure is straightforward. It does not require your father to accept charity. It requires him to accept a business relationship, which is different. You arranged this today, she said. I arranged the framework. Your father would need to agree. You arranged this today, she said again, while I was sitting in that drawing room telling Edric no. I arranged it last week, he said. When Pembry first told me about the debts, I did not mention it earlier because I did not want you to feel that I was managing your situation without your consent. A pausa. I am mentioning it now because you have handled your situation and this is separate. It is about your father, not you. Rosalind looked at him for a long time. This man, this impossible, infuriating, extraordinary man who had walked into her dressing room and fastened her hooks, and then proceeded to spend the next several months quietly building a structure around her life, not to contain her, but to give her something solid to stand on. Why? She said. He looked at her steadily. Because you matter to me, he said. All of it. Your father, your freedom, your ability to make choices that are actually yours. All of it matters to me. A pause. I am not trying to acquire you, Rosalind. I am trying to make sure that when you choose something, you are choosing it freely. She felt it then, the full weight of it. Not a flutter, not a warmth. Something deeper. The feeling of a door that had been quietly opening for weeks, finally standing wide. She stepped forward. She put her hand against his chest, just above his heart. He went absolutely still. She looked up at him. At the pale gray eyes that had found her in a chapel, in a ballroom, in a drawing room, and had not once looked elsewhere. at the face that had learned, somewhere between his father and his motherless house and all those quiet years, to hide everything, and had spent the past several weeks showing her things anyway. "Hadrian," she said softly. "Yes. Stop being careful with me." Something broke open in his expression. That was the only way to describe it. Like ice in early spring, not shattering but releasing, the long-held giving way. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his chest. "If I stop being careful," he said, very quietly, "I will tell you that I have been in love with you since the night I walked into that room and found you trying to close your own dress and lifting your chin at me like I was the inconvenience." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "I will tell you that I have been patient because you needed to choose this freely, not because I have been uncertain. I have not been uncertain for a long time." She looked at him. "Then stop being patient," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Long enough to be sure, she thought. Long enough to make absolutely certain this was what she meant. And then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not tentative. It was not polished. It was the kiss of a man who had been holding something carefully for months and had just been given permission to set it down and simply feel it. His hand came up to her face, and she felt the warmth of his palm against her jaw, and she leaned into it without thinking because thinking had stopped being available. They stood in the entrance hall of her family's townhouse, with her mother diplomatically occupied in the sitting room and the London night pressing at the windows, and when they finally drew apart, Rosalind pressed her forehead against his jaw and breathed. "7 months ago," she said, "I was standing in a chapel waiting for a man who wasn't coming. I know. And now I am standing in my father's hallway kissing the Duke of Varenhold. Yes." She lifted her head. "I did not plan this." "Neither did I," he said. "I came to a political wedding as a courtesy. I took a wrong turn." She laughed. It surprised her. The genuine, unguarded kind, the kind that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. He watched her laugh with an expression that was entirely unmanaged, pure and still and honest. "Go home, Hadrian," she said, stepping back. "Before my mother comes to investigate." He released her slowly. He straightened his coat. He was composing himself back into the Duke of Varenhold, layer by layer, and she found she could see every layer now, could see what was underneath them, and the knowing of it felt like something she would carry forward. "Tomorrow?" he said at the door. "Tomorrow," she said. He left. She stood in the entrance hall and pressed her fingers lightly to her mouth and smiled at the middle distance like a woman who had just discovered that life, after all its arrangements and abandonments and carefully managed heartbreaks, still had the capacity to surprise her. 12 days later, the danger arrived. It did not announce itself. It never did. It came in the form of a note, pushed under the door of the Mayfair drawing room during a Tuesday morning meeting that Rosalind was not attending. Hadrian found it when he returned from a brief errand. He read it once. He folded it. He sent immediately for Pembry. The note was unsigned. 3 lines only. "Tell the Duke to remember who he answers to. The Hampshire connection will not be forgotten. The woman should be reminded that princes have long memories and longer resources." He read it again. Slowly, carefully. Then he sent for his carriage. Rosalind received the second note at 4 in the afternoon, delivered not through the house but through a footman she did not recognize, at the side entrance, addressed in a hand she had never seen. She opened it in the hallway. "The engagement was never truly ended. There are documents your father signed. Ask him about March 14th. She stood very still. Then she went to find her father. Lord Edmund Kane was in his study. He looked up when she entered, and the particular quality of his expression, not surprised but something already bracing, told her everything before he spoke. "March 14th, she said. He closed his eyes. "Father, what did you sign?" "It was—" Rosalind, the dead, had reached a critical— He stopped. He tried again. "In March, a representative of the Calvin House approached me. They offered a relief of the primary debt in exchange for a conditional reaffirmation." "A conditional reaffirmation of what?" "Of the original betrothal agreement." He looked at his hands. "It was framed as a formality, a bridge document," the man said, "to preserve the legal framework while the diplomatic situation in Calvin was resolved." Rosalind looked at her father. She felt very cold and very clear. "You signed a document reaffirming my engagement to Edric in March," she said, "after I had returned to London, after the public ending, while I was—" She stopped. "I did not believe it would be used." her father said. I believed it was a formality. The debt was pressing, and the man was persuasive, and His voice broke slightly. I am sorry, Rosalind. I did not understand what I was doing. She turned. She walked out of the study. She went to the entrance hall and called for her cloak and her carriage and sent a footman running to the Mayfair address with a single line. Come now. It is urgent. Hadrian arrived in 20 minutes. She met him in the sitting room. She handed him the note. She told him what her father had said. He listened to all of it without moving. Then he looked at the note again. Then he set it down on the table and stood there for a moment with his hands very still at his sides. He has a document, Hadrian said. Apparently. Signed in March. Yes. That document was obtained under duress, he said. The debt was the lever. Your father did not sign freely. He paused. It is not legally binding. Can you prove that? I need to see the document first. He looked at her directly. And I need you to be somewhere Edric's people cannot reach you while I do. I am not going into hiding. I am not asking you to hide. I am asking you to be somewhere specific with people I trust while I move through the next 24 hours, doing things that require my full attention and not a simultaneous concern for your safety. She looked at him. He threatened you in that note, she said. The first note, the one to you. Yeah. He threatened to use resources against you. He made an implication, Hadrian said evenly, which I am taking seriously. She studied his face. The controlled stillness. The pale gray eyes that were, she had learned, most dangerous when they were most quiet. She thought about what it meant, that Edric had both notes sent simultaneously, one to Hadrian, one to her. That he had timed them to fracture. That he believed the way to dismantle what was between them was to hit both sides at once, to make Hadrian feel threatened professionally and Rosalind feel legally trapped. He thinks if he pressures us from two directions we will separate, she said. Yes. He thinks you will prioritize your position over me. Hadrian looked at her for a long moment. He does not know me at all, he said quietly. She breathed out slowly. All right, she said. Where do you want me to go? Lady Pembry's residence. Pembrys are above reproach and their house is, he paused, safe. I will send 2 of my own men to stand outside. Your men. Yes. She looked at him. How long have you had men positioned for this? Since Edric returned to London, he said simply. She stared at him. You have been managing a security arrangement for 3 weeks without telling me. I did not want to alarm you without cause. He met her eyes directly. If the cause did not materialize, the knowledge would have been an unnecessary weight. The cause has materialized. I am telling you now. She wanted, briefly, to be furious at him for the management of it. She wanted to insist that she could have handled knowing, but she looked at his face, at the complete absence of manipulation in it, the straightforward, honest calculation of a man who had weighed her comfort against her safety and made a choice, and the fury dissolved before it could build. Next time, she said, tell me. Next time, he said, I will. She picked up her cloak. At the door she paused. Hadrian. He looked at her. Be careful, she said. His expression did something she had never seen before. Briefly, entirely unguarded. Something that looked very much like the face of a man who had not been told to be careful in a very long time and did not know, suddenly, what to do with the weight of being someone's concern. I will, he said. She left. He stood in the sitting room for a moment after she was gone. Then he turned and picked up the unsigned note and read it one final time. His face was very still. He went to work. The night was long. Rosalind sat in Lady Pembry's private sitting room with a cup of tea she did not drink and a book she did not open, and she listened to the house settle around her while London moved through its indifferent hours outside the windows. Lady Pembry herself, a warm, sensible woman who asked no unnecessary questions and made excellent company precisely because of that quality, sat across from her with her own needlework and said nothing that required answering. It was past 11 when a footman appeared at the door. A message from His Grace, my lady. Rosalind took it. The handwriting was Hadrian's, spare and deliberate, written quickly but without losing its precision. The document has been located. Your father's solicitor was cooperative once the full circumstances were explained. I am with my legal counsel now. Do not worry about the night. I will come to you in the morning. H. She read it twice. She folded it. Lady Pembry looked up from her needlework. Good news? Progress, Rosalind said. In my experience, Lady Pembry said mildly, progress from Hadrian Corell tends to arrive fully formed. He is not a man who does things partially. Rosalind looked at her. You know him well. I have known him since he was 24 and newly made Duke and absolutely convinced he could manage everything alone. She pulled a thread through her work with quiet efficiency. He was wrong about that. He is better now. A pause. You have something to do with that, I think. Rosalind looked at the folded note in her hands. She thought about a man sitting somewhere in London with his legal counsel at 11 at night, working through documents, refusing to leave a problem unfinished because the problem had her name attached to it. I hope so, she said quietly. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. Morning came gray and cold, with rain pressing against the windows of Lady Pembry's guest room. Rosalind dressed early. She was at breakfast when the sound of a carriage in the street reached her, and then footsteps in the entrance hall, and then Hadrian's voice asking for her. She was already standing when he came through the door. He looked tired, not defeated. She was not sure Hadrian Corell had a defeated expression in his range, but the specific tiredness of a man who had been awake most of the night doing precise and necessary things. His coat was slightly less perfect than usual. His hair had been pushed back from his forehead at some point and had not entirely returned to order. She thought he had never looked more like himself. Sit down, she said. You need tea. I need to tell you what happened first. You can tell me while sitting. Sit down, Hadrian. He sat. She poured. He accepted the cup without argument, which told her how tired he actually was. The document, he said. Yes. It is genuine. Your father signed it in March, as he told you. A representative of the Calvin diplomatic house presented it as a bridge agreement. He wrapped both hands around the cup. However, the man who presented it was not officially credentialed by the Calvin government. He was a private agent acting on Edric's personal instruction, not on behalf of the Calvin crown. Rosalind went still. Which means, Hadrian continued, that the document was obtained through a private party misrepresenting his authority. Your father believed he was dealing with an official diplomatic representative. He was not. The agreement was therefore obtained under false pretenses, which in English law renders it void. A pause. My counsel confirmed this at 2 in the morning. I had the formal opinion in writing by 4. She looked at him. You were up until 4. I was up until 5, actually. There was also the matter of your father's primary debt, which I addressed through the Hampshire arrangement I mentioned. The framework was agreed and signed last night. Your father has been notified. He met her eyes. He wept, apparently. My steward was somewhat unprepared for that. Rosalind pressed her hand over her mouth. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming, slightly absurd fullness of the moment, the image of her father weeping in front of Hadrian's steward at some obscene hour of the morning, while his debts evaporated on paper. The image of this man, this deeply private, deeply capable man, spending an entire night dismantling the architecture of a threat because it had her name in it. You solved everything, she said, in one night. I solved the legal and financial components, he said. There is still Edric. She looked at him. What about Edric? He needs to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that this is finished. Hadrian set down the cup. I would like to speak with him today. I am telling you this because I will not do it without your knowledge, and because I want to make sure you understand that what I intend to say to him is entirely separate from any conversation you and I still need to have. What conversation do you mean? He looked at her steadily. The one, he said, about what comes next. For us. The rain moved against the windows. Lady Pembry's house was very quiet around them. Rosalind looked at Hadrian across the breakfast table, at the tired face and the direct eyes and the hands that had spent a night building her freedom back from the pieces other people had scattered, and she felt, with absolute clarity, the thing she had been moving toward since a dressing room in Cavendish Hall. Speak with Edric first, she said, then come back. You will be here? I will be here. Edric received him at the Calvin diplomatic residence on Belgrave Street at 10:30. Rosalind was not there. She did not need to be. But she would learn, later from Pembry, who had accompanied Hadrian as a witness, what was said. Pembry told it quietly and without embellishment, which was the most accurate kind of telling. Hadrian had entered. He had sat down. He had placed 3 documents on the table between them. The legal opinion on the fraudulent representative, the voided bridge agreement, and the Hampshire arrangement confirming Lord Kane's debts were cleared. He had then looked at Edric and spoken for approximately 4 minutes without interruption. He had not raised his voice. He never raised his voice. He had said, according to Pembry, something to the following effect: that the document was void, and that Edric's agent had exposed the Calvin diplomatic house to a serious legal liability that Hadrian was, at present, choosing not to pursue. That he was choosing not to pursue it in the interest of maintaining the trade relationship between England and Calvin, which was worth considerably more than a personal dispute. That this choice was contingent on one thing, and one thing only: that Prince Edric of Calvin would make no further approach to Rosalind Kane, her family, or any representative acting on her behalf, through any channel, formal or otherwise, for any purpose. Edric had said very little. At the end, according to Pembry, Edric had looked at the documents for a long moment, and then looked at Hadrian and said, "You love her." And Hadrian had said, "That is not your concern. My concern is that she is free. She is free. We are finished here." He had stood. He had left. Pembry had followed, slightly breathless. In the carriage back, Pembry reported, the Duke of Varenhold had sat in complete silence for the entire journey and stared out the window with the expression of a man who had done the thing he set out to do and was now thinking about the next thing he needed to say. He came back to Lady Pembry's house at noon. Rosalind was waiting in the sitting room. She stood when he came in. He looked better. The exhaustion was still there, but something in him had settled. The way a man looks when he has resolved a thing he has been carrying and can now set it down. "It's done," he said. "I know. Pembry sent word." He looked at her. "You spoke with Pembry?" "He could not resist telling me the carriage part," she said. The staring out the window. Something moved at the corner of Hadrian's mouth. "He talks too much. He admires you enormously. It comes out as talking." She looked at him steadily. "You told Edric you loved me." He asked a direct question. "You could have not answered." "I do not generally leave direct questions unanswered," he said. "You know that." She did know that. She had known it since the first morning in the East Sitting Room at Cavendish Hall, when he had answered her questions about trade policy with the specificity of a man who respected her enough to assume she could follow. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him. Close, the same distance as the entrance hall the other night, but this time without the contained hesitation, without the careful management of what she was allowing herself to feel. "I love you," she said. He went very still. "I have been arriving at it for months," she continued, "and I have been slow about it because I did not trust my own judgment after Edric, and because you are not an easy man to be certain about. You keep yourself at a distance, and you manage things quietly, and you show your feeling in documents and business arrangements rather than in words, and I kept wondering whether what I was reading was real or whether I was constructing something from the material of my own wanting." She looked up at him. "But last night," she said, "while I was sitting here waiting, I stopped wondering. Because a man who did not love me would not have stayed up until 5 a.m. destroying a fraudulent agreement and rebuilding my father's finances and sending me a careful note so I could sleep." She paused. "That is not management. That is devotion, and I am done pretending I do not see it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his hands came up to her face. Both of them. The same large, certain hands that had closed her dress in the candlelight of a dressing room she had been standing in alone, and he held her face and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, directly and without apology, except now it was entirely unguarded, and she could read all of it. "I have loved you," he said, "since you turned around in that room and looked at me like I was the inconvenience, and then could not quite make yourself ask me to leave." She laughed. The unguarded kind again. He kissed her. Not like the entrance hall. That had been the first breach in a long wall. This was different. This was the other side of the wall, warm and certain and unhurried, the kiss of two people who had stopped pretending they were not here and had decided, at last, to simply be here. When they drew apart, she kept her hands against his chest. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "Ask you what? Whatever the next question is, the actual one. Stop arranging things around the edges and ask me the thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very simply, "Marry me." Not the shape of the thing wrapped in flowers and strategy and structural requirement. Not a document or a political framework. 2 words stated plainly, by a man who had decided what he wanted and had the remarkable courage to say so without decoration. Marry me, he said again, softer. Not because of your father or succession or what London will think, because I want to spend the rest of my life in rooms that you are in, because you are the most alive I have ever felt and I do not want to feel any other way. Because when I walked into a dressing room and found you alone in a half-closed dress trying to hold yourself together before a wedding to a man who did not deserve you, something in me said, there she is, and I have not been able to unsay it. Rosalind looked at him. At everything she had catalogued over these months, the almost smile and the direct eyes and the hands and the patience and the 4-minute speech to a prince in a diplomatic residence and the night spent on documents and the note that had arrived so she could sleep. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He exhaled. It was the only moment she had ever seen him visibly release something held too long, and the sight of it made her chest ache with tenderness. She pressed her forehead to his jaw. He folded his arms around her. They stood there for a long moment, quietly, while the rain continued outside and London went about its business and Lady Pembrey, who had been passing the sitting-room door with completely unnecessary frequency for the past 30 minutes, heard the silence and smiled to herself and went to tell the kitchen to prepare a better lunch. The announcement appeared in the Gazette 3 weeks later. The Duke of Varenhold and Lady Rosalind Kane are pleased to announce their engagement. The wedding will take place at Cavendish Hall in the spring. London read it over their breakfast tables and had opinions, as London always did. The general consensus was that it was the most satisfying sequel to a scandal in recent memory. 300 guests who had sat in a chapel at Cavendish Hall and watched Rosalind walk to an empty altar found, upon reflection, that they had always rather hoped it would end this way. Cassian Morby said something pointed at his club and was ignored. Edric, from Calvin, sent a brief and formal congratulatory note. Rosalind read it and put it in the fire, not with anger, with the calm of a woman who had stopped giving the past more room than it required. Her father, whose debts were clearing month by month and who had been meeting with the Hampshire suppliers with an energy and purpose she had not seen from him in years, came to her one evening and took her hands and said, "He is a good man, Rosalind. I was a fool not to see it sooner." "You saw it eventually," she said. "You saw it first." "I saw it in a dressing room at 11 at night when he was technically trespassing," she said, "which I admit is an unusual foundation." Her father laughed. He laughed like a man who had been let back in from the cold, and the sound of it was one of the best things she had heard in a long time. The wedding morning came in spring. Cavendish Hall stood in the early light with its familiar grandeur, except that this time the light was golden rather than snow white, and the roses in the formal garden were beginning to open, and the chapel smelled of lily and warm stone and the particular bright hope of a morning that had arrived exactly as it was supposed to. Rosalind stood in the dressing chamber, the same room, the same mirror, the same morning light, through the same high window, and looked at herself in the glass. The dress was different. She had chosen it herself, from a dressmaker in London who had listened to exactly what she wanted and produced exactly that. No more, no less. It was ivory silk with a simplicity that was not plainness but precision. It fit perfectly. Every hook was already closed. She had closed them herself. Her mother stood behind her, bright-eyed. Lady Maren Kane, who had adjusted her cuffs with increasing frequency during the previous wedding morning, stood this morning with her hands folded and her chin up, wearing the expression of a woman who had arrived at the right ending and intended to enjoy it without qualification. "You look extraordinary," her mother said. "I feel extraordinary," Rosalind said, and meant it, not as performance, not as the careful composure she had developed as armor, but as simple fact. She was happy. Clearly, unambiguously, without asterisks. A knock at the door. Her maid opened it. A footman stood outside holding a small package, dark gray wrapping, no crest, Varenhold livery. Rosalind took it. Inside, a bracelet. Thin gold with a single pale gray stone. The same pale gray as his eyes, she noted, and suspected this was not accidental. Underneath it, a card. One line. "I will be at the altar. I will not be anywhere else." She read it twice. She put the bracelet on. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time. At the woman who had stood in this room once before, with someone else's veil, and someone else's arrangement, and her own quiet dread, and she barely recognized her. Not because she had changed outwardly, but because the person looking back was fully present, fully choosing, fully here. She picked up her flowers. She walked to the chapel. The chapel was full. The same 300 people, more or less in their finest. The same candlelight, the same music, the same long walk between the pews. But Hadrian was at the altar. He had been there for some time before she arrived, she suspected. He was not a man who arrived at the last moment when something mattered. He stood straight and still in charcoal, and when the doors opened and the music changed and every head in the room turned, his eyes found her immediately. They stayed there. She walked toward him with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who was arriving somewhere she had been heading for a long time, and as she came closer, she watched his face, watched the controlled stillness that was not coldness but depth, and the pale gray eyes that held nothing but her, and the moment, halfway up the aisle, when something in his expression opened in the way she had first seen in Lady Pembry's sitting room, all that careful management simply setting itself aside. She reached the altar. She stopped in front of him. "Hello," she said softly, echoing the morning she had said it over the bracelet note, over the quiet archive of small moments they had built. "Hello," he said. He took her hand. The ceremony was not long. They had both, independently, asked for brevity. The meaning was in the choice, not in the length of the ritual. The words were old words, and they said them clearly, looking at each other, without the performance of people who needed witnesses to confirm what they felt. When the ring went on her finger, she looked at it for one moment. Gold, simple, real. When the vicar said the words that completed it, and Hadrian leaned down and kissed her, quietly, deliberately, in front of 300 people with no apparent concern for any of them, she heard the room exhale around them like something that had been held too long, finally let go. The celebration lasted well into the evening. At some point in the golden hour before dinner, when the guests had spilled onto the terrace and the gardens, Rosalind found herself standing at the edge of the rose beds with a glass of champagne, looking out at the grounds of Cavendish Hall. The roses were out. The evening was warm. Somewhere behind her, Hadrian was speaking with Lord Pembry. She could hear the quiet cadence of his voice, which she had memorized entirely by now, could identify it across a room without looking. She heard him excuse himself. She heard his footsteps on the stone path. He came to stand beside her. He stood close. Not the careful maintained distance of November, not the managed proximity of a man trying not to show his hand. He simply stood beside her, his shoulder against hers, his eyes on the garden. "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at him. At the profile, the jaw, the dark hair, the gray eyes on the roses, and at the loose ease of his posture, which she had come to understand as the rarest thing about him. He was only fully still when he was in a room with her. She had noticed this 3 months in and had chosen, at the time, not to say so. Now she thought she would say so tonight, later, when the guests had gone and the hall was quiet and they were alone. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the back of a chapel on the worst morning of her life, with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had decided she was the most important thing in the room and saw no reason to disguise it. "Good," he said. She leaned into him slightly. He put his arm around her. They stood at the edge of the rose garden while the evening settled golden over Cavendish Hall, and the sound of their wedding celebration moved around them warmly. She thought about November, about an empty altar and 300 watching eyes and a woman walking to face them alone, because she had decided that dignity was a choice she could make even when everything else had been taken from her. She thought about a wrong turn in the east corridor, about 2 hands, certain and unhurried, closing the hooks of a dress, about a note that said if you have need of anything or simply want someone who will not offer you sympathy, about 1 waltz and 1 sitting room and 1 long night of documents and 1 question asked plainly without flowers or architecture, "Marry me," and her answer, obviously yes. She pressed her cheek briefly against his shoulder. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair. Neither of them said anything. The moment did not need words. It had been arriving for a long time, and now it was here, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Real. Chosen. Entirely hers. Later, when the last guest had gone and Cavendish Hall had settled into its evening quiet, Rosalind stood once more in the dressing chamber. The same room, the same candlelight, the same mirror. She reached back for the hooks of her dress. The door opened behind her. She did not turn around. "I can manage," she said, and smiled at herself in the glass. "I know," said Hadrian from behind her. "You always could." He crossed the room anyway. His hands found the hooks with the same certainty as the first night. Unhurried, precise. One by one, this time in reverse. The silk loosened. The candlelight held them both in the mirror. She watched his face behind hers. He was watching her. "We began here," she said. "Yes. A wrong turn. The best one I ever took," he said quietly. She turned around. He was looking at her with everything visible. All of it, the depth and the feeling and the year of patience and the love that had never needed announcing because it had been present in every choice he made from the night he walked into this room. It was all there in his face, unmanaged, completely hers. She put her hand against his chest, above his heart. He covered it with his, and the candle burned on, steadily, warmly, in a room where something that had begun with a door left open and a wrong turn had arrived, after everything, exactly where it was meant to be. If you stayed until the very last word, through the chapel and the sitting room and the waltz and the long night and this final candle, then you already know that this story was never just about a wedding. It was about a woman who refused to be arranged, who built her own terms, even when the cost was steep, who chose herself before she chose anyone else, and in doing so, finally found someone worth choosing. And it was about a man who expressed love not in grand declarations, but in documents signed at 4 a.m, in notes that arrived so she could sleep, in a single waltz, in hands that were always certain. The lesson Rosalind carried out of that chapel in November was this. Dignity is a decision. You can make it in the worst moment, in front of 300 people, with no one beside you. And the people worth having in your life will see that decision and move toward it, not to rescue you, but to stand with you. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment telling us which moment stayed with you. Was it the chapel, the waltz, the documents at 4 a.m, or that final candle? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support means everything, and it is what makes these stories possible. More royal stories, more love that is chosen rather than arranged, more women who lift their chins and walk forward. They are all coming. Stay with us.